To formally begin the event, I'd like to welcome Ingrid Cumming, who will provide the Noongar Welcome to Country. Ingrid is a traditional owner and custodian of the Whadjuk Noongar Country and Managing Director of Cart Court Wen. And she's an amazing young woman, and we're very delighted that she's here to welcome us to country. Ingrid.
As a custodian and traditional owner of this particular area we call Whadjuk Noongar Country, it really is an honour to carry on the thousands and thousands of year-old practice which is Welcome to Country, what we call Wanju Budja. The whole history behind that is when we had new friends, new family come to country, we would welcome them, we would celebrate in ceremony and advise the best ways to move and enjoy their time in this country. So on behalf of my ancestors past and present, for without them I couldn't stand up here and perform these ceremonies, and I thank them. I'm going to now sing you a songline that comes from a place called Calamurda. Anyone ever heard of Calamurda living in Perth? Does it sound familiar to something? Kalamunda. Yeah, so Kalamunda is actually a Noongar word. A lot of people may not have ever had the opportunity to understand the importance of that place, especially in a cultural context. And what it is, it's a place of ceremonies that take place, especially togetherness, coming together ceremonies, as I think is well represented here today. And then I'm going to give a gift. Usually I give out a message stick, but in this particular case, like I did last year, I'm going to give out a women's rope used in ceremony. And this year, for the two speakers, they're in the colours of the female red-tailed cockatoo. And to Noongar people, that represents law and healing. Yeah. So I'm going to sing to you now. I'll give $50 to anyone who can translate what I'm about to sing. I'm in trouble if there's other Noongar women in the room or men. But all jokes aside, I'm now going to carry on that ceremony. And in the spirit of reconciliation, I invite you all to clap along with me as I sing you to country. Thank you. Australia's got talent. I always say that after. Oh dear. All right, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask today's speakers, Jane and Catherine, to come up and to receive these gifts from the Whadjuk Noongar community, to thank them for their contribution today and to wish them all the very best as they travel through our country and beyond.
Thank you.
I would now like to read a statement from Her Excellency, Ms Quentin Bryce, AC, Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia. My friends, on the occasion of the 2012 Clare Burton Memorial Lectures, I remember with love a friendship that was important and influential across my life, and indeed remains so. It was my great privilege to share with her a professional and personal engagement for over 20 years, to walk and work together on issues of the greatest moment for social justice and human rights. I recall so well her vigorous and unrelenting adherence to the finest principles, her pursuit of equality and reform, her advocacy for women. First and foremost, Clare was a scholar, and a scholar of the highest order. The breadth of her publications was extraordinary, each one of them soundly based, each one of them underpinned by strong commitment, each one of them thoroughly practical, and all far-reaching in their influence. These underpinned her robust and vocal participation in conferences, lecture series and symposia. For all of us in the women's movement, her voice was one of the best known, most genuine and trustworthy in articulating what mattered and what would drive us forward. As I shared the stage with her on many occasions, or watched from the audience, I marvelled again and again at the tenacity of her intellect, the power of her argument, the persuasion of her language, the courage of her conviction. The memorial lectures will continue to be an enriching contribution to her memory and to the fields in which she so faithfully laboured. Thank you to the Australian Technology Network of Universities WexDev program and other universities for continuing to organise and host the events and lectures. Signed, Quentin Bryce. I think we should thank the Governor-General for such wonderful words. I'd now like to call upon the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Education at Curtin University, Professor Jill Downey, to officially open today's lecture.
Thank you very much. It gives me great pleasure to represent the Vice-Chancellor today, and as Lindley said, she sends her warmest wishes and apologies for not being here. In opening this event today, I also would like to acknowledge the Noongar people as the traditional owners of the land on whose grounds we meet today, and to particularly thank Ingrid Cumming for her warm welcome to country. I think it was inspirational and very enjoyable. Can you join me in thanking her again? Thank you also to Lindley for delivering the statement from Her Excellency Ms Quentin Bryce AC, the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia. Obviously a very dear friend of Clare's and I guess demonstrating the warmth of the lady herself. There are many distinguished guests here today, and in particular I'd like to acknowledge just a few. Ms Jane Caro and Ms Catherine Fox, our guest speakers for today, and we're delighted to have them with us. Ms Jenny Perkins, the Director-General from the Department of Communities, Ms Maria Saraceni, Chairperson of the Women's Advisory Council, Professor Majella Fransman, Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Humanities at Curtin University, Professor Clare Pollock, Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Health Sciences at Curtin University, Professor Lynn Cohen, Executive Dean, Faculty of Education and Arts, PVC Engagement Communities at Edith Cowan University, Dr Lindley Lord, Director of the Maureen Bickley Centre for Women at the Curtin Graduate School of Business, and a previous speaker for the 2010 Clare Burton Memorial Lecture. I welcome you all to the 14th annual event to celebrate and commemorate the life of Dr Clare Burton. It's wonderful to see so many of you here today, representing university, government and public sectors. Many of you have attended these lectures over the past 13 years, and we thank you for your continued support. There are some of you here today who knew Clare personally and were touched by her or influenced by the work that she did. The Clare Burton Memorial Lecture was initiated by the ATN WexDev, which is the Women's Executive Development Program established by the 5 universities of the Australian Technology Network: Curtin University, Queensland University of Technology, Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, University of South Australia and the University of Technology, Sydney. ATN WexDev is a strategic career development program designed for senior women, both academic and professional staff within the ATN universities. As a program, it aims to improve the underrepresentation of women in Australian universities, particularly at senior level, a situation Australia shares with the international university community and the broader government and business community. At Curtin, we're continually aware of the need to promote the equal representation of women at all levels of the organisation and across disciplines, particularly in engineering, science and ICT, and to pursue gender pay equity as well. Contributing to the equitable representation of women in society generally is also a priority for us through education and career opportunities, and we provide our female undergraduate and postgraduate students with such opportunities. Clare Burton passed away in August 1998 and was someone who made a difference during her lifetime. In Australia during the 80s and 90s, Clare was the intellectual force behind employment equity programs. It was her academic research on gender and race bias and work as a public sector administrator that became the basis for policy both within the public and private sectors. Clare was often referred to as the guru of equity practitioners. In remembrance of Clare, these lectures support the awarding of the Clare Burton Scholarship, which was established by Clare's family and the 5 ATN universities to honour and continue the work of Dr. Clare Burton into aspects of gender equity. The $10,000 scholarship is open to postgraduate students within an ATN university for a research-based gender equity project. To date, through these events, Perth has contributed more than $17,000 towards the scholarship. I'd like to acknowledge Belinda Johnson from the RMIT University, who was awarded the 2012 Clare Burton Scholarship for her research on the intersection of work, gender, lifestyle and imagined career through the experience of young women employed casually in designer fashion retail. We are honoured today to have with us the Director-General from the Department of Communities, Ms Jenny Perkins, and later we'll hear from Jenny when she introduces our guest speakers for today. Ms Perkins was appointed the Director-General for the Department of Communities in August 2010. She had extensive experience in social policy and community development across non-government, local and state and government sectors. She holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Arts Public Policy from Murdoch University and a Bachelor of Social Work and Social Administration Honours from the University of WA, with her career spanning non-government, local, state government roles. We're very grateful to have Jenny with us today. I'd also like to welcome and acknowledge our renowned speakers, Jane Caro and Catherine Fox, authors of The F Word, How We Learnt to Swear by Feminism. Building on the rich legacy of Clare Burton's research and advocacy for women in the workforce, today Jane and Catherine will bring their own particular take on the idea of for love. Jane and Catherine commenced this lecture series in Sydney on the 30th of October, which would have been Clare's 70th birthday. Their final lecture will take place on the 27th of November in Canberra, and we would like to congratulate you, Jane and Catherine, on what I believe has been a wonderfully successful lecture series so far. We've had wonderful accolades from across the country where you've presented already, and I believe the ABC National Television is going to pick up the lecture in its Big Ideas program to be broadcast shortly. Finally, on behalf of the Australian Technology Network, WEXTEV and Curtin University, I'd like to thank the key sponsors of this event. In Perth, the Western Australian Department for Communities, Women's Interests, your ongoing support has been generous and your financial contribution greatly appreciated. Across the state, the Equal Opportunity for Women in the Workplace Agency and the South Australian Minister for the Status of Women, the Honourable Gail Jargo, and their generous contributions. I'd also like to acknowledge the Western Australian Department for Communities and EOWA, as they've been long-standing partners for this event. Enjoy your main courses, and after that we'll hear from Ms Jenny Perkins, the Director-General for the Department of Communities, who will introduce our guest speakers, Jane Caro and Catherine Fox. Thank you again for all coming, and a very, very warm welcome to this event. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you.
It is a pleasure to be here today to introduce and welcome our guest speakers, Jane Caro and Catherine Fox, for this year's Clare Burton Memorial Lecture. The State Government, through the Department for Communities, is very proud to be able to partner with Curtin University in this important lecture series, and I am very pleased that we're able to contribute to the debate on gender equity and drive it forward with new information ideas. It's also heartening to think that the proceeds of this event will contribute to the Clare Burton Memorial Scholarship Fund, which supports postgraduate research into gender equity. As you know, Dr. Clare Burton was a leader in driving forward the gender equity debate and strove to ensure that public policy was informed by good research. Her work in the 1980s and 1990s put equal pay on the industrial relations agenda, and her book, Redefining Merit, became the Equal Opportunity Practitioners' Bible. Given Clare's legacy as a leading researcher, academic, consultant and author on gender equity, it is fitting that we are about to hear from two women who are both passionate and published in this field. This year's theme, For Love, examines the premise that women's work and their achievements are measured against a set of tenacious and traditional assumptions, underpinned by the idea that women should be driven by love and selflessness in all they do, and not the recognition and rewards that drive men. And to examine that idea today, we welcome Jane, Caro and Catherine Fox. Jane did suggest I introduce them both as just a couple of Sheilas that have come to talk to you on this subject, but I will follow my notes just to make it a bit more formal in case you haven't read the promos. So Jane Caro is an author, social commentator, columnist, broadcaster and award-winning advertising writer. And I believe also a beef producer and timber grower, if I was right in terms of what I accessed on the web. Today she runs her own communications consultancy and lectures in advertising creative at the School of Communication Arts at the University of Western Sydney. Many of you may recognise Jane as a regular panellist on the ABC's Gruen Transfer. Early on this week, the Department of Communities had the pleasure of Jane presenting at the Sexualisation in Children seminar, which was convened by my department with the Commissioner for Children and Young People, contributing to some very robust debate on what is a very complex agenda. An award-winning journalist, Catherine Fox, focuses on the issues facing women in the workplace in her weekly column Corporate Women in the Australian Financial Review, and is deputy editor of the Financial Review's Boss magazine. Prior to joining the Australian Financial Review in 1989, Catherine worked in financial marketing and consulting in Sydney and London. Catherine has authored a number of books, including co-authoring with Helen Trina the book Better Than Sex, How a Whole Generation Got Hooked on Work. I mention this only to share with you the risks of Googling. To help prepare for today, I did Google Better Than Sex in just a shorthand way, which Catherine failed to deliver your book, but did deliver me access to the top 10 things better than sex and the Better Than Sex cake site from Weight Watchers. So, and I admit a number of other websites that I suspect have resulted in me being placed on my IT department suspect list. So, both Jane and Catherine have published multiple books individually and also collaborated on their 2008 publication, The F Word, How We Learnt to Swear by Feminism. Their professional relationship and their partnership today in terms of doing the presentation, my understanding builds on a very long-term relationship and friendship as they've been neighbours and have done the school runs together. So we have the pleasure of having two people who've worked very closely together and understand each other in that regard. So building on the rich legacy of Clare Burton's research and advocacy for women in the workforce, Jane and Catherine will bring their own particular take on the idea of for love. We could have better guides, I don't think, for a subject that's overdue for discussion. So without further ado, I'll welcome Catherine Fox to the stage, who will be presenting, following by Jane, and then there will be a Q&A session. So welcome, Catherine.
My daughters are appalled by the titles of my books. Thank you very much, and thank you for the warm welcome. We're delighted to be here, as we always are, because we are Sheilas and we do love banging on about this topic. I want to first, of course, thank some of the people who organised this series. So we have, in fact, been around Australia doing gigs, our last one being on coming Tuesday in Canberra. At the wonderful Anna Reader, who's based at UTS in Sydney, who helps the ATN WexDev group to put these talks on at the lecture series every year. Anna not only had two very busy women to wrangle, but at the beginning of the proposed time frame that we were looking at, I had twin daughters doing their HSC, the hideous end of high school exams in New South Wales, which was not much fun. But I managed to absent myself most of the time because I'm that kind of mother. It gets worse. Look, it's always a delight for me and an incredibly engaging topic, of course. I've spent a lot of my life talking about this, both professionally and personally, and Jane and I have certainly done our fair share of that load, haven't we? And I just always find it's one of those topics that just has an extraordinary impact. One of my colleagues at the Financial Review wrote something we call Talking Point, which can literally be about anything, an opinion piece in the paper last week about her marriage to a divorced man. And she wrote about some of the issues around that and was absolutely amazed by how much feedback she had, some of it positive, some not so. And we were saying at work how whenever you write about these issues, you sort of unleash a torrent of commentary. And it's a very emotional topic. And not just for us, the ones who are meant to be emotional. I found, in fact, a lot of men find this a very emotional topic. In fact, a couple of months back, I was in Canberra when Liz Broderick, the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, was releasing the second part of her very in-depth study on women in defence. And during the morning, I saw her in the evening at a meeting, and during the morning she'd been at one of the launch events, and a very irate man said to her, "You are the greatest threat to Australia's security ever." So that's what can happen. Of course, I also want to thank the wonderful Clare Burton, who I actually never met, but I feel as though I almost know. I suspect she'd be incredibly proud to see the depth and nuance of the research into women and work these days. And I think she'd quite rightly appreciate, I hope she would, the progress owes much to her groundbreaking efforts on these on areas such as, indeed, the ones that were mentioned earlier, merit systems and gender pay equity, two of my favourite topics, I must say. That this is now a topic of legitimacy in academia and, in fact, in the business sector and other arenas should not be taken for granted, and I think we do owe her so much in that area. Today, as has been mentioned, Jane and I want to speak to you about the notion that women work for love, mainly, and not so much for money and status. We believe there's a fascinating story in examining why women are still regarded as inherently motivated by caring and ideally a form of selflessness in all their activities, whether it be in paid work or unpaid work or elsewhere, while responsible men work for money, status and respect. Translated into some sort of broader beliefs, this is actually about who does the supportive, soft, supplementary stuff versus the mainstream, important work in the world. It struck us as a useful, timely and fascinating topic for this forum. In fact, even more timely than we had originally thought, given that we were nutting this out 2.5, 3 months ago. And we also thought it touched on some of those overt and covert beliefs and norms that continue to define women, their work and their standing in society. Clearly, we've each tackled the topic from our different perspectives, but with some core themes. But first, I wanted to can't resist making a few comments about a watershed moment that has brought the topic of women and workplaces and their treatment onto the national agenda. The Prime Minister's recent speech about sexism, which has left some scratching their heads in bewilderment, others fuming at, paradoxically, the injustice of it all, and many cheering here and internationally. The reception of her comments revealed a gap, a startling one really, between formal political commentary and the reality of life for many people in Australia and clearly in other parts of the world. But the ensuing debate, which at times devolved into the semantics of sexism versus misogyny, also showed there's still a strong belief that the topic of gender equity is a special interest or side issue to the important stuff in society. This attitude is deeply familiar to me, as I said when I was asked about it on my one and only appearance on Q&A recently, a nerve-wracking experience. For more than 2 decades on the Fin Review, if I managed to get an interview with a CEO or senior executive about the lack of women in their senior ranks, something they find fairly hard to deny, I was assured there simply was no problem. That response, by the way, always reminded me of how I felt when early in my first pregnancy, a male doctor told me that childbirth didn't really hurt that much. He was wrong. If women wanted the top jobs, these executives would tell me, then they'd get them. They obviously just didn't want them, because we're always being offered them too, aren't we? And the gender pay gap was due to women working in part-time jobs and so on. So Julia Gillard's comments validated the concerns and silent frustration of many women in all walks of life and kinds of workplaces. Like other women who have tried to raise this issue as a genuine concern on many levels, I found hearing her comments gratifying and vindicating. And it was clear that she was standing up for something that she did believe in, and condemning what has been an extraordinary litany of abuse that she's faced in the 2 years that she's been our first female Prime Minister. Many businesswomen I've spoken to since then, regardless of how they vote, have said they found it quite inspirational and uplifting too. They felt her comments at last provided some recognition of what they have endured and on many occasions in their formal working lives. And elsewhere, clearly. I also think that the work of Anne Summers in researching the level of abuse directed at the Prime Minister in her recent speech, Her Rights at Work, which I do recommend you to read if you haven't already done so, should also be acknowledged. I was at a forum earlier this year where Anne was speaking, and a woman in the audience congratulated Anne on her significant work as a writer, political activist, and obviously supporter of women's rights over many decades. She responded by laughing and saying, "Oh, well, it's self-interest." But it got me thinking that distinguished women like Anne and Clare Burton have also inspired and led by example in their own dedicated research and writing on women and paid work, the double standards they confront, the bias they face in their careers, simply for being female. These distinguished women have helped to make it clear that our capacity to really contribute and be recognised in the work we do hinges on how women's efforts are judged and valued, and the gender effect on status and therefore access to things like careers and leadership roles. This was no peripheral issue. It was about the right for women's work to be taken seriously. I've often heard my writing on corporate woman referred to as a special interest. I've been told I must love the topic. This apparently, of course, justifies my investment in something which often rubs people up the wrong way, is clearly not seen as a popular topic by some of my colleagues, and even a bit old hat. If I never hear the expression post-feminist again, it will be too soon. It's as though this issue of equality for half the human race and nearly half the Australian workforce, of course, is a sidebar to the mainstream wheels of commerce, with little recognition that my gender continues to play a key role in not just how I am viewed and my identity is formed, but how my total contribution as a journalist, whatever I'm writing about, is assessed. No wonder I'm interested. In particular, I've been focusing in recent times on teasing apart the rhetoric from the reality about women's work and examining the gap between the evidence we now have about women's workforce participation, their qualifications and their efforts, and the tenacious myths still being recycled in the business community, which is why I wrote my recent book, 7 Myths About Women and Work, fairly self-explanatory. During my career, I've spoken to many women from many different backgrounds, educational levels and age groups, and I've been repeatedly struck by how their formal working lives and how they feel about their jobs, whatever they may be, simply don't stick to the script peddled about our efforts. Sadly, however, tell women for long and often enough that what they do is somehow not up to scratch, or they have a special female approach that just doesn't cut the mustard, and they too start to believe it. Show them that mentioning sexism, by the way, will get a bucket of bile dumped on them, along with accusations of playing victim to cover up their failures, can also be slightly off-putting. My observation after many years of business reporting and 30 years in the workforce is that women discover there are many informal and unhelpful assumptions made about why they are in paid work and the quality of what they do. These gendered assumptions have a massively negative effect on their employment prospects, sometimes cutting off their options to apply for certain jobs or for progression before they even know they exist. If I had $1 for every angry woman I've heard fuming about being given a poor score on leadership or ranking on their ability to network and thus being overlooked for a new role or a promotion while a bloke with less skill was promoted, I'd be a wealthy woman. So my research on the 7 myths, and indeed for the column, which clearly, I should say, focuses on a mainly well-educated and white-collar workforce, clearly being in the Fin Review, helps to reveal why the notion that women get a sufficient warm inner glow from helping others and don't need as much in the way of status or reward is still potent. I've examined why women are told they work in a meritocracy, so if they succeed or fail, it's all their fault. They lack ambition, and if they had any, it disappears once they give birth. along with half their brain. They are their own worst enemies. They should behave more like men to get ahead, and that time will heal all these irritating gender issues. We are also told regularly that there are simply not enough women for serious management jobs. I find it extraordinary that we're still hearing that one recycled. This also feeds into a widely held belief that using legislated quotas, for example, for women on boards carries a real danger of tokenism and shock horror, and I've had finger-wagging expressions from very senior businessmen. You'll go backwards, they say, because we've gone so far, clearly. The idea women work for love and have a predisposition to care helps to reinforce most of these myths, I've realised. I think they are a legacy of women's intrusion into the male domain of paid work, where their presence has still not been normalised all these decades on. This continues to be supported by the old-fashioned but still alarmingly widespread notion that women are somehow temporary workers or supplementing the main breadwinner until they marry and tend to the family, or risk becoming lonely, sad, work-obsessed spinsters. I'm surprised how often this kind of narrative is informally expressed by men and women, and even by people in their 20s and 30s that I work with, who I'm often told are much more enlightened about these matters. For example, if women return to work after kids, it's still almost necessary for them to justify their presence as a sad consequence of the cost of paying off a home loan. Their heart isn't really in it, the thinking goes, and they should be darn grateful to be allowed back into their jobs too. Their lack of seriousness, for example, being unavailable 24/7, I mean, who is, but anyway, is seldom linked to the fact that they continue to subsidise their husband or partner's career by shouldering the domestic load, and that really hasn't shifted. But just what does the research tell us about what motivates men and women in the workforce? It's a hot topic, of course, motivation in the management literature, and over the years, being on a magazine like Boss, I've interviewed a host of the gurus: Tom Peters, Jim Collins, Gary Hamel, John Cotter, Charles Handy, and written many features for the magazine about what motivates us at work and why, since the days, in fact, of Frederick Taylor, who, of course, became well known for Taylorism, a really dirty word in management, and his influential work with Henry Ford on how to ratchet up the productivity of manufacturing production lines. The mechanics of how to motivate workers has been the subject of much attention. It's kind of the holy grail for businesses, eager to work out the switch to flick when it comes to getting more effort out of employees. These days it's slightly different. There's talk of employee engagement, a search for meaning in our work, intangibles, inclusive corporate cultures, and bringing the whole self to the job. I never realised we only brought half of ourselves to the job, but there you go. While some of this rhetoric is greeted with a certain amount of scepticism, yes, by people like me, there is some broad consensus that cash alone is not a sufficient incentive to make us work harder and better. Of course it plays an important basic role. But satisfying and stimulating work that is appropriately recognised and rewarded is what drives most of us, regardless of gender. And it turns out the major studies on workplace motivation don't actually reveal a significant gender split. As I quoted in my book, Australian research also shows men and women have not only similar ambition levels, but when they do leave a job, and we do have data about this from exit interviews and so on, they leave for much the same reasons. So they leave because the quality of work's not good, they have a lack of development opportunities and career progression, and they feel that their managers are not very good. Well, that's a strange one, hey? Particular issues labelled as female, such as blending job and family responsibilities, for example, are much further down the list and are cited by both men and women. Ambition levels, according to several major studies, are also pretty much the same for men and women up to mid-career, with young women actually registering higher levels of ambition than young men. Yet again, it is par for the course to hear that women somehow generically lack ambition. And of course, that other favourite sweeping generalisation that we lack confidence. Of course we do. But once again, the latitude to express ambition and a desire to succeed, an attachment to the job, not the people or the team or the community, the work community, I believe is circumscribed for women and often laden with judgment. While women are expected to be caring and sharing colleagues, expressing dedication to your job or the technicalities of it, or a career, can be fraught with danger for women. Once they become mothers, many women find they run the gauntlet of condemnation if they don't express some form of that socially acceptable desire to be at home with the kids rather than at the workplace, regardless of their own income needs or their skill as patient child carers, which was clearly not really my forte. These expectations are simply not applied to men or fathers. And also this is where that very unhelpful expression having it all is used as a weapon to remind women to get back into the box and stop being so greedy. Imagine telling a man with a job and a family he's having it all. It's a ludicrous idea. Anne-Marie Slaughter's recent article in The Atlantic, the US magazine, highlighted how even very smart, well-educated women have been swept up and made to feel guiltier by this particularly malicious and sexist rhetoric. Women who run into the motherhood penalty soon understand they are transgressing the norms of the ideal worker, which is still based on a male breadwinner model, and find their tenure or career path may indeed be compromised, whether they work full-time or take the mummy track of part-time work. It's not great for women without families either, who are sometimes portrayed as having made an unacceptable sacrifice. Their skill, career success or strong work ethic are not viewed in quite the same way as their male peers, and they may even be seen as pitiful and a warning to young women about what happens when you abandon love for money. There are a few areas where the pitfalls of simply being female in the workplace are more apparent than the gender pay gap, which is roughly the same now as it was 25 years ago, depressingly at just over 17%. And I know Jane will also talk about this. In my book, I examine the sheer misinformation peddled about the topic, which is highly emotive and leads to significant denial about the size of the phenomena. What we find in most studies is that it's acknowledged that most people think there probably is a gender pay gap, but they don't think it's very big, and they think there's very logical reasons for it. This is certainly the studies I've looked at, more men than women think that. When it comes down to it, pay scales differ for men and women in similar jobs because of a series of highly subjective judgments made about their skills and the value of what they do. These, I believe, are underpinned by the notion, once again, that women don't work for the same reasons or rewards as men and can suffer from a series of female-only deficits, too emotional, too detail-oriented and too soft. It's bizarre how some of these things have become negatives, isn't it? Of course, they're expected to use these talents to nurture their workmates, but are not usually rewarded for it. And in fact, they run the risk of being penalised if they don't conform to the stereotype. It's a bit of no win. Pay negotiations are another area where women's supposed natural nurturing and softer side is used as a rationale for their failure to either ask for or successfully garner appropriate pay increases, unlike their savvier male colleagues. Yet, despite all the perceived wisdom on this topic, several studies, including a couple from the excellent US not-for-profit firm Catalyst, some of you may well be aware of that firm, have found that the cohort of well-educated women in US workplaces do indeed ask for pay rises just as often as men, and their negotiating approach is not strikingly different. They fail, however, to achieve the same results because women walk a fine line in these negotiations. Too demanding, they're seen as unfeminine and pushy, too quiet, and they lack confidence. And if they lack those female soft skills, even if they are technically proficient and good at what they do, they are also unlikely to win approval. It is rarely considered that many women fail to assertively and routinely ask for more pay, despite clearly having the ability to do so, because it's probably been apparent to them for most of their lives that the care work, they are told, is what they naturally bring to the table, is expected and not usually rewarded. Things get really tricky the further up the ladder you go. Last year's consulting firm Bain and Chief Executive Women study, What Stops Women from Reaching the Top, found that men and women agreed on the 4 highest ranking attributes of leadership: problem solving, influencing, team building and networking. And I quote from the study, "When ranking themselves on the same attributes, women undersell their capabilities even though they are deemed to be equally as effective as men at delivering value for their organisations." So they're producing the same outcomes. Even worse, the study says, men completely agree with women. Men are twice as likely to rank other men over women as being highly effective problem solvers. Even though women are deemed to be as capable as men at delivering results, the reality is that a woman's approach to achieving these outcomes is less likely to be valued. Our research shows that women are perceived to be less effective at the leadership attributes that are most emphasised and rewarded by organisations. What a coincidence. The stark fact is women's collaborating style, teamwork and so on, is not perceived to be as effective as men's promoting style, regardless of what they're doing and what they're achieving. The findings reveal a self-fulfilling stereotype, very much active still in the workplace, and particularly among senior males, that equates women with caring and support and men with doing. There's an expectation a woman running a team, for example, will help others to shine, which of course is a desirable goal for any manager, but a particular expectation for women. And if she fails to do so, she can find that she's personally condemned and earn a poor reputation, whereas men, I've found, have been really penalised for putting their own interests in front of the group. I've also long suspected that the naturalness of women's caring skills, which proves to be such a burden rather than an advantage in the workplace, needs examination. I'm a major fan of last year's Clare Burton presenter Cordelia Fine, who actually we were delighted to have at our RMIT lecture this year, and her work examining spurious scientific claims about the differences between male and female brains. And can I recommend her work to you? It is really very, very good, and she's got a wonderful sense of humour. It seems to me some of the skills long assumed to be inherent in females are actually an acquired survival strategy. I recently interviewed the wonderful US feminist and founder of the Women World Leaders Group, which is a group set up about 15 years ago. Her name's Laura Liswood, and she's an advisor to Goldman Sachs. And I was rereading her book, The Loudest Duck. You have to read the book to find out why it's called that. Something to do with squeaky wheels might put you onto it. And came across this quote. "I've always been intrigued," she writes, "by where the concept of women's intuition comes from and whether there is evidence to support this notion. President Mary Robinson, the first woman president of Ireland, noted that women are often more likely to observe, have better listening skills, include others not normally included, have more emotional intelligence, and so on. However, she also told me that she felt that while traditionally these were considered female traits, she believes they are traits acquired by most groups or individuals who have been out of power historically. Those who have not been in power will develop those intuitive skills in the interests of survival." Liswood believes that these learned behaviours and assumptions can be seen in other non-dominant groups whose success and survival depends on knowing the dominant group's habits. And I quote, "Those with less power are forced into this role. A similar dynamic existed in the relationship between the coloniser and the colonised, the master and the slave, the served and the servant, or really any dominant and non-dominant groups." As Fine said last year, our minds are exquisitely socially attuned and surprisingly sensitive to gender stereotypes. When gender fades into the psychological background, men and women's behaviour becomes remarkably similar. That sounds remarkably sensible to me, and it highlights why the assumptions we make about the nature and value of a supposed set of women-only skills in the workforce really needs to be re-examined. Given all these factors, it's also quite bizarre and illogical that one of the favoured corporate responses to poor gender equity is remediating women and advising them to behave like men. Well, it's not usually put like that, but that's indeed the underpinning to it. A woman behaving like a stereotypical man, if this is indeed possible, around the boardroom table is still a woman, and probably a fairly conflicted and possibly rather uncomfortable one too. While both Jane and I believe that there are more similarities between the genders than differences, when you are routinely judged against gendered expectations of high standards of caring and warmth and love, it is risky, if not downright dangerous, to advise women to just man up. Double standards still abound when women are deemed to work for love. Paradoxically, the popular management literature is full of references to the need for a new style of executive who is a servant leader, a level 5 leader according to Jim Collins, with strong communication and empathy skills and huge dollops of emotional intelligence. Many of these are in fact descriptions of the archetypal female characteristics I've been talking about. But men tend to be complimented for showing their caring side in the workplace with their colleagues, or indeed if they do the daddy run and leave early for soccer practice. Most of the mums I know sort of slink out of the office if we have to go and do something like that. If they don't regularly show their softer side, there are a few automatic penalties. Women get routinely underpaid and overlooked for this behaviour, and if they dare to transgress and fail to exhibit appropriate warmth and care, they are quite quickly penalised. For example, the dreaded ladder pullers, that expression that refers to women who climb the ranks but fail to nurture and mentor those below, are held up as examples of what goes wrong for women in senior ranks, and we do burden women with a much higher level of behaviour. We expect more from them. Yet men who behave like this, and I've personally observed quite a few, but I have been in a newsroom for a few decades, are simply not noteworthy or punished. In fact, in some corporate environments, they are rewarded. Of course, as the management gurus and articles reiterate, caring for those around us in the workplace through supporting and advising others and mentoring them, putting the interests of the team before your own and so on, is held up in most companies as a really important part of the job. And I think that they mean that in theory. Unfortunately, there is much more lip service than reality about these skills. Our conclusion is that because they are associated primarily with women, they continue to be poorly recognised and rewarded when actually exhibited by women. A driven, ambitious and assertive woman who makes no bones about her desire to lead is also in danger, likely to fall foul of stereotypes and be viewed as cold, steely and, well, let's face it, we all know she's a bit of a bitch, isn't she? Is it any surprise women find it difficult and time-consuming and incredibly tiring to negotiate workplace dynamics, to be recognised for what they do, or that they struggle to articulate their motivation or satisfaction in their work when they don't stick to the well-worn story? Given the penalties they face for stepping outside the boundaries, women often do conform to the stereotypes and prop up the myths, and who could blame them? The funny thing is, of course, is that just like men, women wage earners work for a variety of reasons, but the basic one is to earn their living. Fear of losing their livelihood means women often find they have no choice but to be complicit with the idea they are biologically motivated more by caring than money or status. No matter how well qualified, women in paid work thus face a very difficult trade-off. Encouraged to work for love in their jobs, and at home, of course, and be good team players, but then facing a very real risk of failing to be valued or seen as serious workers with management and career potential. Everyone knows that we need to love, care and support others, which is why I went away when my girls were doing the HSC. I'm getting over it. Whether we are at home or at work, but not everyone is actually expected to deliver and to do it. Far too often, women fall into the role of supporting and enabling others who get on with the real work. It's time we lifted this burden from women and found a fairer model that values everyone's efforts without the gender blinkers. In short, it's time we shared all the work and asked the question 50-50. If not, why not? Thank you.
I hate doing that. And it's only going to get worse. Because you know what happens after 50, don't you? You get shorter, fatter and hairier. Sad but true. But here's some good news. According to a recent study, 66% of Australian women would rather receive a promotion than a marriage proposal. Hallelujah. Finally working out which side our bread is really buttered. We have to butter it ourselves to find that out. This is not an interesting bit of trivia. It is a revolutionary change because what it indicates is that Australian women are at last valuing money over love. It's a good thing girls don't stop it. For generations, or maybe even millennia, we divided the accepted spheres of the genders into the public and the private, the personal and the political, the nurturing and the remunerated, those who worked for love and those who worked for money. Women, you'll all have heard this phrase, were venerated as the angels of the house, romanticised as graceful, beautiful, self-sacrificing saints who kept their home fires burning for their husband and children. Even a tough old battle axe like Florence Nightingale, who single-handedly not only created the modern nursing profession but reformed the hospital's hygiene and sanitation systems, yes, I mean ditches and drains, across the British Empire, was sanctified and trivialised as the Lady of the Lamp. Blech. Worse, she did her extraordinary work not just from her bed, which is a remarkable thing, but also as a volunteer. In other words, literally for love. As Catherine pointed out, even today, women are seen as being motivated by entirely different reasons than men. Men do things for rational reasons, women for emotional ones. Women are motivated either by the love of self, vanity, or by the love of others, sacrifice. Trapped by the ancient Madonna or whore dichotomy that can be defined as both the light and the dark side of love. The Madonna represents mother love, pure, ethereal and saint-like, a creature to be venerated and adored from a distance. The whore represents sexual love, earthy, seductive, hypnotic and wicked, a creature to be enjoyed but then discarded and blamed. And I use the word creature here deliberately. Neither of these archetypes is human. In fact, they have little to do with real flesh and blood individuals at all. They're all about how women are seen by men. This is what we mean when we talk about women as object rather than subject. We're still largely seen in the context of other people's lives, mostly men's lives, rather than at the centre of our own. Catherine's also mentioned this, but we really can't talk about this subject at this particular time in history and not mention it twice, at least. The recent glaring disconnect between women's visceral responses to Julia Gillard's cri de coeur about sexism and misogyny, a response felt around the world, and the male-dominated mainstream Australian media's dismissive response to the same moment, is all about the blindness many still have to women being at the centre of their own lives. The unmediated access women suddenly have to the public conversation via social media, #destroy the joint being a powerful example, is becoming as powerful a liberator in its own way, I believe, as the invention of the pill. Both have brought feminism roaring back onto the stage, and ain't it grand? As a society, we still struggle with seeing women as entirely human. And it is interesting to speculate if this is because, as love objects, women are seen as valuable only in relation to others, not simply as themselves. As Catherine pointed out, women as a whole have been seen as the servant gender, as slightly lesser men. Catherine also mentioned that this view of us as existing only to serve the needs of more important others, husbands and children certainly, but also parents, brothers, charities, communities, the church, the lord of the manor, the shopkeeper, the John, the pimp and the brothel, has meant that we are not used to taking women seriously as individual human beings with the same rights and responsibilities as everyone else. For centuries, we've emphasised the differences between the sexes. Whilst not denying the obvious differences, as Catherine has said, I think we're now making a plea for us to begin to emphasise our similarities, and you're going to have to forgive the French accent here. I want us to go from vive la différence to vive la similarité. But why? Isn't difference the spice of life? Yin and yang, what makes the world go round? Maybe, but the trouble with the idea of equal but different, the exact phrase used to justify apartheid in South Africa, by the way, is that it tends to work out really well for the equal but bloody lousy for the different. And when we talk about the differences between the sexes, we mean women are the different ones, that they are different from men, never the other way around. The idea that women are different, naturally softer, more nurturing, more collaborative, more caring, all euphemisms for more loving, in my opinion, that they're better at detail, read, better at the boring, repetitive, low-status, poorly paid jobs that nobody else wants to do, is still used to explain why they're paid less, own less, and apparently don't want the top jobs. The stereotype of the gender that is motivated primarily by love creates a handy excuse, as Catherine said, for not taking women's contributions seriously. Hugh Mackay, in his book What Makes Us Tick, lists the 10 desires that need to be met before we can live a satisfying life. He's not talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, he's taking it one step above there. He says that they're listed in no particular order except for the first, which he says is the most important, and that is the desire to be taken seriously. After reading this, it suddenly struck me that the whole history of feminism, from Mary Wollstonecraft's original cri de coeur about vindication of the rights of women, is in fact a struggle by women to have their own views, perspective, ambitions and contributions taken seriously. That in essence is what feminism is about. One of the ways we indicate how seriously we as a society take someone is how much we pay them. Fairly straightforward. The 17.2% pay gap between the average earnings of full-time working men and full-time working women is a clear message to women that we regard their efforts, their work, their achievements and skills as of lesser value, both literally and figuratively. Our aim in this lecture is to examine how this idea of women as naturally more suited to loving sacrifice than ambitious acquisition continues to allow us to fundamentally trivialise an entire gender. A good example of how this works, even today, is the fact that women GPs earn between 10 and 35% less than their male peers. This striking pay gap between workers with the same training, skills and tasks was explained by the study that uncovered it by the different way female and male GPs practice medicine. The study described it as the tears and smears method, a classy description, if you think about it. Female GPs apparently spend longer with their patients and rack up fewer consultations than men. Female GPs arguably take their patients more seriously than they take their own income, while male GPs do the opposite. Taking others' needs more seriously than your own is an archetypal definition of love. We see more clear evidence of this in the way the feminised professions, teaching, nursing, HR, childcare, community care in general, are both underpaid and undervalued. The recent powerful win by community sector workers, 87% of whom are women, in their claim for equal pay, where they not only won a whopping pay increase of up to 25%, if you think about how all governments are running around the world going, we've got no money, we've got no money, that is really extraordinary. But it also forced Fair Work Australia to agree that the sector was underpaid because it was dominated by women. This is not just an important acknowledgement, but it also forced us all to take systemic discrimination against women seriously for the first time. Indeed, it was heralded as the first decision of its kind anywhere in the world. The work these women do includes caring for the elderly, for the disabled. They do their care at home or in nursing homes, and also for very young children as childcare workers. Traditional women's work, meant to be motivated by love apparently, rather than seen as serious and important tasks that should be paid for and valued. Until this landmark decision, in fact, it was almost like we resented having to pay for such work to be done at all. There remains an entrenched attitude that mothers should care for their own children and daughters for their elderly parents. When people mutter darkly about feminism destroying the family, it's just these kinds of derelictions of loving duty that they are referring to. As mother and daughter substitutes, therefore, we punish the female community sector workers by grudgingly paying them very little and fundamentally disrespecting the very real work involved in what they do. In fact, when the union announced its win, this really got up my nose. There was much tut-tutting in the media about the fact that this would send the costs in the sector up, and the people who would suffer most for it would be, of course, wait for it, working women. Not working parents or workers with elderly parents in general, notice just women. Apparently men arrive fully formed in the world. They have no parents that they need to take responsibility for. It's quite extraordinary. And apparently they have nothing to do with the production of children either. It's entirely female responsibility. Emily Maguire, in her excellent essay, The Invisible Women, Carers in Australian Families, quotes nursing historian Marie-Françoise, I wish I didn't have all these French names in this, I really do, Marie-Françoise Collier as saying, care is at the very root of women's history, as it is around care that the main part of women's destiny is woven. Maguire argues that caring is seen as a moral chore or obligation more than it is seen as work. And there's a more insidious side to this moral obligation. As Maguire points out, carers, whether paid or literally doing it for love, cannot just walk off the job and leave their patient or their client or the child they're looking after to fend for themselves. There is a real loving connection between the carer and the cared for. Nurses, teachers and the above-mentioned community workers also face this dilemma, and you'll notice they always make sure there are people in place to continue the care. They can't just down tools. In fact, it's really weird. The sort of jobs where you can just get up and walk off the job and, okay, you inconvenience people, are the ones that we value and pay very highly because they tend to be done by men. The sorts of jobs where you can't do that, where you really have to make sure there are people still there to make the wheels at least turn, are the ones we least value and least pay for, even though demonstrably they are really important. We have a bizarre way of just missing this stuff. Despite encouraging signs like the survey I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, 66% of women who are finally getting the idea, and the courageous and stubborn campaign by the community workers to have their work taken seriously as real work, this tendency to take the contributions of women less seriously than the contributions of men is not just something men do to women. It is also something women do to themselves. The new desire among many young women to take their husband's name, it's probably a resurgence of a desire to take their husband's name, is an interesting contradiction to the survey that indicates women would rather a promotion than a proposal. Or maybe not such a contradiction when you think about it. Assuming your husband's surname is a hangover from a time when women were quite literally owned by men and had no legal individual identity at all apart from as someone's daughter or someone's wife. Seemingly oblivious to its fundamentally sexist origins, young women are happily reinvigorating this tradition and arguing that they're doing it for, pass the bucket, love. The trouble with this kind of love is that it is about subsuming your identity, another symbol of how we still see women as not complete in and of themselves. The visceral power of this tradition is easily understood when you consider that while we can now mostly accept a woman keeping her own name and those families who give their children hyphenated names, perhaps, we are still shocked by the very few men brave enough to take their wives' names. This is seen as literally unmanning them. A man's identity must never be sacrificed, but we almost expect a woman to give hers up to prove the seriousness of her love. It doesn't always work, however. Princess Diana's official title when she married the Prince of Wales was supposed to be the Princess Charles. I kid you not. As a commoner, she had no right to a royal identity except as his wife. Such was her star power, so seriously did the world take this deceptively shy and self-effacing young woman that she was never known by any other title than Princess Diana. Princess Michael of Kent, it seems, is not made of such stern stuff. Yet somehow it never works the other way around, does it? A man is never expected to take his wife's name, however important she may be. It was never suggested, for example, that Prince Philip be called Prince Elizabeth. Mind you, he was a member of the Greek royal family, so maybe there was something in that. But no one ever suggested Anthony Armstrong Jones become Prince Margaret. I'd have given my eye teeth to see that, to tell you the truth. Again, men are always seen as individuals and their identity taken seriously. Women are not. Women, it seems, can and should do just about anything you ask them to, for love. Catherine talked about this as well, that the sense many working women have that their role is illegitimate and must be justified and defended is all about their sense that they are somehow neglecting their womanly duty, particularly if they're mothers, to put their children ahead of their work. One of the reasons, among many others, that many dual-income families are attracted to private schooling for their children may be explained by the idea that paying fees for your child's education allows working women to neatly combine their desire to work for money, that being the only kind of work seriously valued, with their need to be seen as good and loving mothers. Hence the "I only work to pay the school fees" explanation neatly resolves the internal conflict. Sadly, I think that is brilliant marketing on the part of private schools. It is working women who are expected to take time out when children are ill or in concerts or under high pressure. It is common to see women take a year off to help their child through final year exams. Not Catherine, of course. She is slack as. She got on a plane and pissed off leaving them to it. I applaud it. But it is very unusual to see such behaviour from a father. It always drives me nuts to hear a business magnate eulogised as someone who, despite working 80 hours a week, always put his family first. Let's get real. The only way men like this can work such long hours and accumulate such wealth is by having a wife who actually puts the family first. Don't think we are for a moment dismissing the importance of love, however. We simply want to share around a bit more with the blokes. In return, all we ask is that they share a little more of the stuff that actually generates income. Thank you, we'll do a swap. It is wonderful. It's starting to happen. It is starting to happen. It is wonderful to see men with the smallest of newborns in pouches strapped to their chests as they wheel trolleys around supermarkets or simply read the paper over a coffee in a cafe on a Saturday morning. They are the lucky recipients of partners who've gained enough confidence in their right to sometimes put their own needs first and insist they get a morning off from childcare, and so enable their male partner to begin to build a real relationship with their children in the only way possible, by doing some of the actual parenting work. As you can imagine, if anyone tries to tell either Catherine or I that a man is babysitting his own children, we quickly put them right. What he is doing is parenting them, and he should just bloody well do it. This idea that he's somehow doing his wife a favour? In fact, we believe that the perspectives women have learned from their 2,000 years plus of being expected to do things for love is of enormous value. Although we are very wary of the discourse that eulogises women as intrinsically nicer than men, I think that was very much Catherine's point about this burden we place on women to be nicer than men, and we sort of blame them if they're not, going around doing great things for women if they get into power, which is a sexist assumption. So we're very wary of that. We don't believe it for a minute. We think the two sexes are just as capable of being nice and nasty as one another. It's just women's experience and the expectations that society places upon them that is different. An example of perhaps of what could be gained if we took women's different life experiences seriously can be seen in the worldwide applauded Finnish education system. You're all aware that Finland is consistently at the top of the league tables in terms of educational outcomes in OECD comparisons. Pasi Sahlberg, Director General of the Centre for International Mobility in Helsinki, believes that one of the reasons Finland takes its school system so seriously and pays its teachers, mostly women, so well is because of the high level of gender equality in that country. People go to visit Finland all the time to find out the secret of their very high achieving system. And the Finns, they don't have any standard aid testing. They have 1/3 of school students receiving extra help because they have a really forensic special needs program. And early childhood education, for example, doesn't focus on getting the child ready for school. It focuses on understanding the child so they can tell the school how they can most work well with that child. So they've got a completely different focus from ours. They put equity at the centre of their education system, not excellence. And the funny thing is they are much more excellent as a result. So an American delegation of policymakers and educators visited Finland to look at the reasons for that country's extraordinarily consistent high educational outcomes. These delegates asked what political powers were behind Finnish early childhood policies and the central place that child well-being has in that country's schools, because most of the Anglo countries like ours, we do it completely the opposite. According to Sahlberg, the answer was short and simple: women. They were told how gender quotas, oh yes, the dreaded quota word, at least 40% of each gender in public boards, committees and councils have been in force in Finland since the 1980s. The Finnish parliamentarians who were talking to the American delegation argued that unless there had been equal representation of women in the Finnish legislature and every political and professional task force, today's advanced maternity and childcare laws and strong focus on well-being in school would never have come into being. By extension, if child well-being had not been regarded as a basic, the Finnish education system would never have evolved into today's success story. And if you believe, as I do, that a country's future is predicated on the success of its education system, when people argue to me that women's issues are sidelined to productivity, I like to point that out to them. In our slow journey towards taking women seriously, we are seeing that when you do so, you also start to take other marginalised groups in society more seriously too, partly because we start to value humanity, a kind of love, over power. Children's rights begin to be asserted, as we've seen in Finland, but there's another reason for that too. It's not just the education system. When children's rights are asserted, hopefully the Jimmy Saviles of this world will no longer get away with damaging and exploiting vulnerable children for their own sexual satisfaction. Pedophile priests can no longer expect that the mystique and status conferred on them by their church will offer them a cloak of silence and protection as they do the same. I believe that the open talk about child sexual abuse is directly a result of feminism and directly a result in the rise of status of women. Taking women seriously means taking what they care about seriously too, like the rights of children. Taking women seriously means taking the feminine in general seriously, so it also means the fight for gay and lesbian rights gaining ground. As the work that women do gains status, and as much of it remains caring work, caring gains status too. We don't want to banish love as a motivator. What we want to do is break the crippling nexus which sees love divorced from money, as if love is somehow devalued by money. Perhaps that's the point. Not that women should give up being motivated by love, but that society should learn to take love so seriously that it realises just how much money it is actually worth, and at last be bloody well prepared to pay for it. Thank you very much.
We can be grateful today that last night the Gender Equality in the Workplace Act was passed.
Yep, finally.
Yeah. So I wondered if either of you were made director of that agency, what would you see as the priorities to begin work on trying to reduce the gender pay gap?
I think, and Helen Conway is the director, and I think she's doing a great job, so I don't want to make any comments that would make it sound like she's on some limited tenure. I think Helen's very driven by addressing that, and it actually comes down to taking it seriously. We've known about the pay gap, the gender pay gap in this country for a long time, and we've had really good data about it. There's really robust statistical data around the gender pay gap, and has been for a long time. There was a big national study that was done 2 years ago, the Making It Fair report, which went around Australia, gathered evidence from just about every kind of community in this country, and found out that 85% of Australians are outraged that there's a gender pay gap. So it's not as though there's ill will. What I was talking about, though, and it's come through in a number of research reports I've read from the business area, is there's a lot of denial the further up the ranks you go. And you also probably, you're more than aware that the more senior you are, the wider the pay gap. So, for example, there are very few women CFOs of listed companies, but they earn half what their male peers earn. So, look, the data's there. I think what Helen and some of her colleagues at, we can't call it EOWA now, Gender Workplace Advisory, what they're working on is now taking that body of information and starting to get it into organisations. And so NAB have just spoken to me. They've just conducted a second quite thorough pay audit, and they went into business banking because they go into the male-dominated areas now. So they'd done one previously a few years ago with the FSU. They've just repeated it, and they did indeed find quite a large gender pay gap. So then you've got to start to establish what's going on in your own organisation, and then you've got to start to look at ways of doing it. And I know that the agency has a number of tools. They're starting to put out more information. There's an online information kit that's available. I think it's making sure that we apply the considerable amount of work we have to our workplaces. So I'm actually reasonably optimistic. I think that we can start to do that. It's not easy to do. Gender pay audits are not easy to do. The other thing that Jane and I are often asked about is what can we as individuals do about it? And we often say to women, you know, when you can, and I know it's not always the case, but when you can, bring it up. Ask for transparency around pay levels. There's this that we still do it in many organisations. We have a real sort of wall in front of pay. And you know that it's often, the pay gap often arises in variable pay. So once you get into sort of management ranks, it's not your fixed salary, it's your bonuses or whatever. But you must, I think, start to bring it up.
I've got an easy, quick solution. We just mandate that all women can buy everything for 17.2% less than it costs men. I think that'd stop it pretty quick.
Hi, I'm Megan O'Connor from UWA, and we recently participated in the LDW Women in Leadership program, which is a program that's been running for quite some time, so thank you. A quick question about women on boards, and with the new briefing papers from ASIC, how authentic is the drive to increase numbers of women on boards, and how do you, either of you perceive the authenticity of that, and how realistic do you think that new drive is, please?
Look, I think the one thing we have to understand is nobody gives up power voluntarily. No one gives up privilege voluntarily. This idea that the men in the world are going to wake up one day, slap themselves on the forehead and say, oh my God, we've been so unfair, quick, let's give the ladies half of everything we've got, is a pipe dream. The only way you get power is to take it. And I think one of the reasons that the change in the numbers of women on boards from 8% to 13% or something?
It went from 8% to 14.8%.
There you are. It's huge, my God. A whole 1 and a bit woman on every board, but it doesn't work like that, of course, is because they were asked to report. There was a consequence, and it was now. And that's the problem. You do not get behaviour change. You can get, this is advertising speaking, okay? We know you can change attitudes fairly easily. You can get 85% of the Australian population say, oh, the gender pay cap's a terrible thing, or should be more women on boards, or whatever. But to actually change behaviour is really hard. And the only way you change behaviour, those of you who are parents in the room will know this, is there has to be consequences. So, I mean, that's why we put a price on carbon, whatever you think about it. There was a consequence. That's why, if you're going to get women into more positions of power, I suspect there has to be a consequence of not having them there. Otherwise, they'll all go, yes, yes, one day, dearie, one day, when you're good enough. Look, have you looked at the quality of most men on boards? It's not that hard to be good enough.
Yeah, but boy, they're hanging on. I think the efforts were originally genuine, but I found it absolutely breathtaking that some of the bodies, like the Institute of Company Directors, started to come out with this sort of almost ownership of getting more women on boards, as though these incredibly well qualified women, and can I assure you, women who make it onto listed company boards in this country are pretty good at what they do. They really have to be. There is no question the bar is higher for them. Was sort of not there, you know, that they'd done nothing about being qualified and experienced and able to go onto boards. 50% of the women who went onto boards in the last couple of years that this effort has been going were already on listed company boards, so on multiple boards. So we don't have a huge cohort who came in from outside that. The irony being, of course, that boards and chairs will always tell you, but we need people with board experience. And how are they meant to get it? So, I mean, look, we've still got a lot of problems. There's the whole escalation in the number of women appointed, which went from 5% in 2009 to something like 38% in 2011. So it was a big escalation, but it's plateaued already. So we're at the heady, giddy heights, as Jane said, of 14.8%, which is not that different to the US and the UK, both of which have had around that many women on boards for the last few years. We still have over 60 companies out of the ASX 200 with no women on boards. I think there might be a few of them in Western Australia. Again, look, sorry, I'm not beating you up, but you know where I'm coming from. So there was a bit of puff. There was a bit of we are seeing the ASX corporate governance guidelines on diversity now starting to filter through with this reporting season. So we will maybe see a little bit more around that. There are going to be metrics published. There's an if not, why not regime, which, funnily enough, even though we have been slightly cynical about, is being hailed in places like the US as being an absolute breakthrough. It was certainly used by Lord Nicholas Davies in the UK when they put together their guidelines on getting more women into management ranks and boards about a year ago. So in a funny way, we're seen now as being out in front. The issue of legislated quotas is another one. It's, as you know, a lot of countries in Europe have moved to that. And there's still quite a strong push on there. The EU now has a proposal to do something. It's not quite legislated quotas, but it's close to. So whether that will happen here or not, I'm not sure. The business community here has reacted savagely to the suggestion of having quotas. Most of the big companies have said no way. So that has been an incentive for them, by the way. The mere spectre of quotas moved them much further. It was held up in front of them, and they suddenly went, oh, okay, maybe we should do something.
Anyone know any chicks?
Yeah. And that, can I tell you that actually happened?
Oh, yeah.
There were so many women I know who said, I've been rung up, and they said, will you go on a board? And they just said, no, I don't know anything about it. What are you talking about? So there was a bit of that going on. Not a great move. So I
don't know. Lots of blokes get on it with about as much qualification. Yeah. I mean,
but then what happens is, but you know what happens, because women get scrutinised. So if they don't come in with the right credentials, they're immediately seen as being a bit suspect. And the next thing you know, oh well, she was out of the depth.
We had a woman. She wasn't any good.
She didn't work out.
So now we won't have any more because all women are exactly the same.
So Got a lot more that we need to do there. And what's happened with management ranks? Nothing.
Got a question over here?
My question is the impact, or maybe no impact at all, on the growth and more growth of divorced women in the workplace. And I'd ask you whether that has empowered women or has it made them more vulnerable?
Well, I have to say, if you're divorced and you can't go into the workforce, you'd be a lot more vulnerable, I would have thought. I mean, we know statistically that women actually are much more likely to, actually be the ones who instigate a divorce. They're much more likely to leave their husbands than the other way around. But we also know that when they do, their financial status suffers a blow from which they never recover. So they never return to the same financial... Men do, they suffer a financial blow when they get divorced, but they recover within about 7 years. They're back to where they were pre-divorce, and then they go on with a setback, but never stuck in that place. So women who divorce, certainly statistically, take on much more of the burden of the child caring and rearing, which is partly why they go back to work part-time, all those things that become the sorts of financial burdens that have also ended up with us facing a generation of poor old women with no super and going to have to be on the single pension. So I think women are choosing to leave bad marriages. And sometimes I think they may be choosing to leave those marriages because what they found themselves expected to do is everything for love. And they jack up. And they're prepared to take a financial hit to get free of that. And I think we have to applaud women who choose not to saddle themselves to a miserable marriage or to a miserable relationship. What we need to do, however, is to help people have healthier relationships in the first place. Maybe, I don't know about this, I didn't change my name when I got married. All my girlfriends who changed their names, and particularly the ones who then promised to obey, now the improvement apparently in the Anglican Church is that they can submit instead of obey. This just happened. It's such a generous, isn't it great? I'm not quite sure the difference. So who are all divorced. So sometimes I think going into a marriage with the idea that you are two individuals who choose to go forward into life together is perhaps a healthier perspective than I'm going into this marriage with you as the adored male object, because, adored male objects or adored female objects are all very well, but what you end up with is a bloke and a Sheila. And it's better to expect that from the beginning, as I've told my daughters quite a lot. I'm still married to the same man 37 years later.
I think the whole question of financial independence, in fact, I've been having a tussle with someone who wrote in and said, you're getting all of this wrong and you want women to be slaves to the capitalist system. And I said, actually, no, I just think financial independence is something that we would never question for a man. Why do we continue to question it for a woman? That's just ridiculous. And, the Betty Friedan quote, which we used in the book, where she overheard some women speaking at I think it was a UN meeting, about the joys of being wives and mothers and homemakers and not being in the paid workforce. And she said, well, ladies, that's all very well, but you're one breadwinner away from the poverty line. And I actually say that not to be, trivialising or anything. You've got to be able to earn a living. And can I just tell you now that I'm in my 50s, the number of women who I have known over the years when the kids were in primary and I was sort of running in and out like a mad woman and trying to juggle, paid work and the whole thing. And they said, we watched you and we were a little bit smug. We thought, we don't have to do that. We'll go to coffee and blah, blah. And there's so many of them really wish they'd retained some sort of attachment to the workplace. And look, I'm not saying they're all divorced. Some of them are though. Some of them are divorced. But some of them are just going a bit nuts. They really are. Their kids don't want to know them. They really don't. And their husbands are still working and have a life around paid work. And I'm not eulogizing. Paid work can be ghastly. I know that. I'm a journalist. But having some money and the wherewithal to earn a living and do a few things with yourself, it's really important. And we shouldn't apologise for that.
Isn't it interesting how we've ramped up expectations, particularly of motherhood? You know, now they have to sleep in the right way from the very beginning. You've got to breastfeed them till they're 17. You've got to cook them organic food that's been hand-picked from the fields of Himalayas or, you know, blah, blah, blah. You've got to go around with a clipboard and look at all the childcare centres and choose exactly the right one for your child's gifted and talented specialness. You know, and then the schools and so on and so forth. And when can you go out again alone without the children? Not till they're 24, because otherwise they could be scarred for life. Isn't it interesting how we've done that shit just at the time when women, working women and mothers are going back into the workforce? I don't see it as coincidental. Not a conspiracy, but I've always been taught in advertising, follow the benefit. Who benefits from that, I wonder?
Rising standards of household decoration, that's the one. And
bigger houses to be cleaned, and of course quite inappropriate to hire someone to help you with the housework.
Following the global financial crisis, we saw a lot of credit given in the US to companies that did survive that, and a lot of people pointing out that women were on those boards. And I think they pointed to Sweden as well, although they didn't do so well in the GFC. Do you expect that we'll see any flow-on from that in Australia? Increases in women on board.
So that's the classic sort of business case about women's representation, and it's a correlation. It's not causal, and I think we have to be really careful about this stuff. It's like saying women have a magic wand, and if they come in, everything will be better. So I'm wary of those arguments, the way that they're structured. What we do know, though, and there's quite a lot of consistent data around this, if you have a more diverse group around the table making the decisions, you'll get better decisions. Now, we know that fundamentally. So when I talk about diversity, I hate the word gender diversity. There's only two genders, right? It's about gender balance. That's what we should be talking about. So, but when I talk about diversity, I mean age, race, back in a whole lot of things, so you don't have groupthink. And all the stuff on the GFC. It was classic stuff. Those people running the banks, H-Boss, classically, it was waxing lyrical the day before it collapsed about the unanimity on the board. We all think the same. Yeah, that didn't turn out really well.
Yeah, wrong.
Wrong, exactly. So I think what we have to be careful about, we don't want to go down into this cul-de-sac of women are so different, they change everything, they're better. Right? They're not. But they do have different experiences and they can bring different talents to the table. Once we know that an organisation starts to genuinely look for merit, genuinely, i.e. not blinkered by white, middle-aged, pale male and stale group, then we see that they will have probably a better outcome. Yeah.
The best story I know about what a difference it makes having a woman in an unusual position making a decision goes back to the invention of chloroform in the 1850s, around there, 1840s, something like that. And it was heralded by doctors, all of whom were male at that time, as a boon for birthing women. Remembering that, women have only lived longer than men for about 100 or so years because of improvements in childbirth, which used to kill women like flies. That's why there's so many stepmothers in fairy tales. So, it's true. It's true. There's a reason. And the church immediately leapt up and said, no. It is ordained by God that women should suffer in childbirth as retribution for Eve's original sin, the temptation of Adam. That is how, it's all been worked out. They shouldn't be allowed to use it. But just for once in the history of the church, the head of the Church of England was herself a birthing mother, Queen Victoria, who went on to have 9 children. And she grabbed hold of the invention of chloroform, said to the priest of the church, sod off, and used it as an extraordinarily good, beneficial thing for women. And there was no further question. It was perfectly all right for women to use pain relief in childbirth. Apart from the new ramping up of motherhood, where now somehow you're supposed to force a watermelon out between your legs entirely naturally with a few well-placed pants. Yeah. But the best example I can see of how when you have women in positions of power, they make better decisions in terms of women's life experience.
And hasn't it been interesting? I can't resist just the US election. Hasn't it been
yes.
fascinating to see how that group of Republican, middle-aged males who knew all about rape, and contraception,
uterus and sperm
told
outward.
women in the US what would happen to their bodies and what they would allow them to do. And you know how many women voted for Obama? It was extraordinary. 67%, 68% of single women who voted for Obama. I mean, you can't tell women what to do. It's just...
And also, what is so interesting about that is the rank assumption of these men that they could go around making these pronouncements about women's lives, and that most women would just go, "Oh, really, Daddy? Okay, we'll vote the way you say." And women just turned around and went,
We've got a question over.
Hello.
"Hello."
I think we've met. Look, any advice for especially young women who are entrepreneurs like myself with a 1 and a 5-year-old? I come from a culture where gender roles are equally respected, so for me it's not a strange thing to go off and do that. So, but any words of inspiration, I guess, to women who, I guess, are creating their own workplaces, I guess.
Yes, put your own right to have fun as a really, really important priority in your life. I think what women tend to do, and it's again this guilt-driven for love stuff, when they're juggling small children, work, a relationship, being part of the community and all that kind of thing, is that they will put their own fun and pleasure right down the bottom of the list and very rarely get some. I remember going to Tresillian when I had a small child and wouldn't sleep and all that. It's a sort of care place. And the nurse who was talking to us mothers said, "Who of you's been to the hairdresser since the baby was born? Who of you's gone to the movies? Who's done this? Who's done that?" Of course, I was the only one who put up my hand for everything. But none of the other mothers had done any of it. And so I think the really important thing is to remember that you cannot do all the things you're asked to do unless you are also looking after yourself. And there is nothing remotely selfish about saying, "You take care of the baby, I'm going to go out and have some fun." I really think women neglect their own fun. And the trouble with that is you're not a good fun parent if you never have any fun yourself. You're not a good fun supplier if you never have any fun yourself. You know, it doesn't help us. We get very worthy, earnest and a bit boring. We should stop it. Have more fun.
My only advice is actually about something that Jane probably thinks is not fun, but I wanted to just say about work. I remember when I joined the paper and I was in my late 20s by that stage, and it was just sort of, it was one of those things, I'd always wanted to be a journalist, and just for various reasons hadn't got into it, hadn't cracked it. And I got in there and I just thought, oh, this is fantastic. And about a year later, I was pregnant with my first child. And I remember thinking, oh, how am I going to do this? But I knew that I really loved journalism. And I hung on, you know, and I'm not a planner. I don't plan anything. I always write about it, but I don't do it myself. But I just remember thinking this is a job worth hanging on to. You know what I mean? It just was something I really loved doing. I'm not saying I loved the editors I worked for or the colleagues I was with all the time, because clearly that doesn't happen. But you know when you get into something and you think, actually, this really suits me, I know this is a good job, then do try and hang on to it. It's really worth doing, because it's not easy to find those things. And sometimes you're right in the thick of bringing up kids. I had 3 kids in 2 years, so I know what that's like. Hellish. But it was really worth kind of hanging in there. And luckily I worked for a company that even in those days had paid maternity leave. It was an incredible boon. So, you know, stuff like that we should never underestimate. That's really, really helpful. And I say to women, now you have a little bit more negotiating space, use it. Really do. Go and suggest things and say, look, I want to work in this way and this is what I can do. Push the envelope, and it's worth doing.
And remember, Philip Larkin said, you will screw up your kids. That is just the truth of it. Yeah. You will. We all do. Yeah. We all do. As my mother said to me when I went and told her about the fact that she'd screwed me up and how she'd done it, because I was only young and stupid, she said to me, well, you should thank me for those. Those are your opportunities for growth. So don't try too hard. Every time you do something wrong, think, that's another opportunity for growth I'm giving my child. Excellent.
They grow up despite us.
That's
really.
right.
Certainly in our case, anyway.
I think we had other questions. I am quite gobsmacked regularly as to how often my young to me, students who are about 30, the women who are making their way in the workforce, and they come and say, the boss has said, can I go and make the coffee because I'm the only woman in the boardroom? And I'm hearing it as recently as last week. What would you say to those women?
Can't you guess? Can't you guess?
No.
You've got to, you know what you've got to do in those circumstances though? You've got to use some humour. Yeah. You've really got to use some humour, but you must stop it. You must. There is no question. Yeah. So they've got to stop it and say, no, I'm not your mum, or you know, whatever. You've got to work out the way to do it. But you do have to stop it, because I've seen that. I've seen it around me, and it's just horrifying. And Jane's had the same thing, because we're old, you know, we've been hanging around workplaces for a long time. The number of women who've come to me in tears after one of these incidents, and they're pretty breathtaking. And Australia's not good in this regard. People who come here from overseas are usually a bit gobsmacked by the behaviour in offices and workplaces in this country. So you've got to handle it. It's not easy. We can't hand out pat answers, but one of the things that we've told women, and we've had them coming back to us, it's been really encouraging, and we said try some humour, because you know in Australia the biggest sin is to not have a sense of humour. So humour can be effective, especially in a group, and you make a bit of a joke of it, and then they go, ah. So it has to be handled, you know, carefully. But yeah, it's still going on.
Another thing you can say is, oh, okay, I'll make it in this meeting, and obviously, Fred, you'll make it in the next meeting, and Bruce, you'll make it in the meeting after that. And then what do they say? Oh, no, it's a girl thing. You can say, really? I didn't know that. Coffee was something I just came out of the womb with the ability to make.
Because my understanding is that in the European context, in particular Scandinavia, there was some percentages run around that said that if you get to a particular level, the problem goes away.
Critical mass. Yeah.
There's a critical mass. So do we know what that is?
Critical mass theory, which is kind of, you know, been around for a long time, it's around 33, you know, like a third. It's meant to be, and it applies to a whole lot of things. So an underrepresented group of any kind, getting to about a third in a group, in a cohort, changes the dynamic. In Norway, they got to 40% women on boards because they legislated. A Conservative government brought that in, by the way, which was really interesting. However, it's had no effect on the number of women in the management of their listed company. No, none at all. So they're looking at why that, you know, they still are very proud that they've got that quota there. You know, Denmark doesn't have a quota. I was talking to the Danish economist who actually advised the Norwegian government. I'm not quite sure why, but she did. And she said, because Denmark doesn't have quotas, all those Danish women who are very accomplished go and sit on boards in other countries. So, you know, they lose the IP of those women because they'll go and sit on boards elsewhere because there are quotas. So the sky didn't fall in. The unfortunate thing is it didn't have the knock-on effect to management ranks. So that's another issue.
The quota was only on boards?
The quotas are only on boards. Yes, okay, so exactly. But you know, a lot of companies here have brought in targets. Now, I mean, they're not, they're voluntary targets and so on, but they have set them. So, and that's within management ranks. So we're watching with a great deal of interest to see. And most of them are around 35 to 40%. So, yeah.
The other thing to remember when anyone talks about quotas as tokenism and everything is I always bring up that pesky little fact about the 100% quota that operated for 2,000 years, and that we're only asking for like a 30% quota maybe at the outside. We're really being awfully sweet in comparison to the blokes. And of course we already have lots of quotas on boards. We have quotas for interstate directors. Yep. We have quotas about staff representatives on things like the ABC board and things like that. And yet they're okay. They're not tokenistic apparently. It's only as soon as you start talking about it, putting chicks in there.
Yeah. There's a famous article in economics written by an Australian academic called Why a Badly Paid Nurse is a Good Nurse. I'm really interested in what your view would be, the reaction if that article was called Why a Badly Paid Advertising Executive is a Good Advertising Executive.
Well, that's so revealing of the expectations that we have of women. It sums up, in fact, I guess, the kind of subject of this lecture, that we have this view that women should just naturally sacrifice themselves and be glad of the opportunity to do so. And that is very pervasive and very destructive. And what it ends up with is the tragedy of the poor old women who have done everything they were told to do by society, who've been the good girls, who did stay home and look after their kids, who did do a kind of job that wasn't particularly well paid because it had flexibility or whatever, and who did then get divorced by their husbands, and who didn't have any super, and who are now ending up at the end of doing everything society told them to do to the letter, eking out a poverty-stricken existence in an unheated flat somewhere, if they're lucky, and wondering what on earth's going to happen to them when they get sick. It is a disgusting thing we did to that generation of women. Dreadful.
But we started today's lectures with Catherine saying that whenever you raise issues about women, the emotions run high. And I think we've seen a full range of emotions today, from sharing of laughter and wry humour to deep concern about some of the issues that have been raised by today's discussion, both in the lectures and in the question and answers, around why is women's contribution so poorly valued, and why gender equity remains a side dish rather than the main course, when we know so much of the research, when we know, as has been pointed out, that the gender pay gap has just not shifted, when we know the lack of women in senior management positions. There is a need to, I think, become much more active again, to see that F word back on the agenda. The other F word is around framing, and I'll just share something that took my breath away in terms of how women's success can be explained. I was at a conference earlier this year talking about women doing some education in the trades area, and the women were outperforming the men, and we know in lots of educational fields that happens. The researchers asked the lecturers, male and female, why did this happen? And it wasn't because the women are smarter, it was because the women needed to try harder. They needed to work harder. The men were actually smart because they sat at the back of the room and read the newspaper. So it was nothing to do with women's effort or women's intellect. It was yet again their deficit. So we've still got a long way to go. I think I'd just like to, before I offer the vote of thanks, reflect on two final things. Moving to a 50-50, if not, why not? And if we put equity at the centre of our decision-making and our systems, what might happen? Maybe we would get to a situation then when it's for love and money. Could you join with me in thanking our guest speakers?